welcome to another episode of Knowledge Enthusiast, or Ossi comments on, in this case, the rise and fall of Germany by brain4breakfast. And you might know this could be a topic I am personally invested in because, as you might know, I am German, and I'm also part of the rise and fall of Germany because I'm from East Germany. Which brings me to, hi, I'm Ossi. I'm 32-year-old former history student and video game journalist. I was born in East Germany but raised and now living in Hamburg, and yeah, this is Ossi Knowledge Enthusiast, and in case I get something wrong, in case I miss something, you will find the info text box right there with additional information, clarification, and so on and so on. And without further ado, let's start with the rise and fall of Germany.
Before Germany, there was Prussia and Austria and 37 small independent German countries. Napoleon had left Europe in an awful mess, so when he lost, the victorious met in Vienna to fix the borders that he'd thrown all into disarray. This Congress of Vienna wasn't a punishment like a certain treaty a century later would be to Germany, but instead to re-stabilise the continent once more by drawing out the spheres of influence, balancing enemies and allies with and against each other. And this worked.
This is already a whole lot. So these 32 states of Germany were what was left of the Holy Roman Empire after it was dissolved by Franz Joseph, or only Franz II, who in 1806 dissolved the Holy Roman Empire after more than 1,000 years. And then the Napoleonic Wars went and gone, and then there were these 32 states with Austria not really anymore being a part of it, but we had Bavaria, Saxony, Prussia, some free city-states, and so on and so on. Whereas during the Holy Roman Empire at its peak, there were, I think, somewhat around 1,600 different territories in the realm of the Holy Roman Empire. So it was already progress that this has been reduced to 32. And this Congress of Vienna, the most important thing that came out of it by, what was his name again? The Duke of Metternich? Was it the Duke of Metternich? Anyway, was the so-called Concert of Europe, which basically meant that there are 5 superpowers in Europe, which are France, Russia, Great Britain, Austria, and Prussia. And those 5 powers are above everyone else and shall not be in conflict with each other, and they shall not start wars, in the best case. The issue would later be that this led to the very complicated alliance system, which then led to the situation we had in the First World War, because to keep the balance in Europe, when Germany or Prussia and Austria are allied, then 2 other forces need to be allied, and then maybe 3 other forces, which then was the case with Russia, France, and Great Britain, need to be allied to keep this balance, because this somewhat works like today with, or in the Cold War with America and the Soviet Union. You have 2 superpowers with arguably the same strength and, of course, the same level of destruction with their atomic bombs. And because they could both eradicate each other in seconds, they won't start a war with each other. And basically that was the idea behind the Concert of Europe as well.
Once more, by drawing out the spheres of influence, balancing enemies and allies with and against each other. And this worked for a while. The fixed borders and disincentives to war meant that those with ambitions to conquer an empire turned their ambitions elsewhere, to other continents. But there was one fractured region in Europe that was not particularly well balanced, and the two intended balancing powers didn't have overseas colonies on which to take out their frustration. That region was Central Europe, that aforementioned Austria, Prussia, and those 37 smaller independent German countries. The war that eventually happened had been the result of a centuries-old rivalry between the two dominant German powers, and the result of the war was mostly down to four factors: the existing political order, Central European geography, the Enlightenment, and Italy. Prussia and most of the small states were situated in an area of Europe with few natural barriers. Now, while this could make you vulnerable, as the many partitions of Poland can tell you, the way German states behaved was part of what preserved the relative stability of the region despite it being in almost 300 pieces for a millennium. While individually these mostly city-states are vulnerable to outsiders, they recognise the need to band together, multiple times under multiple flags. Collections of states of roughly equal power, so none could really dominate, or at least that was the theory. So Europe was a collection of states in a delicate balance of powers, and at its centre was a collection of states in a delicate balance of powers.
Which then, when Germany unified, they were suddenly one hegemonous country with even more power, industrializing at the rapid rate, even faster than anyone else. By 1900, they were the top industrialized country, at least in Europe, and I think even considering the US, but I'm not sure about that. This was the first domino that crushed this balance of power, because a part of this balance of power was that Prussia was a thing, and those 32 or 31 other states were their own thing. But now Prussia had unified Germany and basically created a superpower above every other superpower. And we will see this in World War I, World War II, when Germany more or less single-handedly can take it on the whole European continent, and only gets defeated mostly because of the US and of course Russia. But in Russia mostly because of they have way more people to throw away.
And at its centre was a collection of states in a delicate balance of powers. In geopolitics, geography is everything. That's rivers, mountains, oceans, terrain, and where your borders lie.
Talks very fast.
Austria was a southeast-facing country with the majority of its land in that direction from Vienna. The branches of the Danube flowed through Austria away from traditional German lands. The Alps and Carpathians mostly protected the core from invaders, but they also isolated Austria from its interests in the north and the west, and its territories on the other side of the mountains. Contrast Prussia, a country wealthy with natural riverine connection.
Now I know that's Bach in the background, and it's the Bach that we all know from the Salmonella videos. Sorry.
On the other side of the mountains. Contrast Prussia, a country wealthy with natural riverine connection, and none of those pesky major mountain ranges separating the political core from its wealthy and industrious regions in the west.
Well, not major mountains like the Alps, but you have to remember that the whole center of Germany, so the parts right between those yellow blobs here on the screen, as well as south, which is Saxony. Those are the so-called middle mountains, a range of various mountain chains. For example, the Ore Mountains, the Harz, and the Sauerland, which all range from east to west or west to east, completely through Germany. But those are not as steep and high mountains as the Alps, for example. I mean, the highest mountain in the Ore Mountains, for example, is 1,290 meters or something. It's all elevated at, so you don't have these massive drops, these steep drops. So it's easier to traverse once you're in there.
On the other side of the mountains. Contrast Prussia, a country wealthy with natural riverine connection, and none of those pesky major mountain ranges separating the political core from its wealthy and industrious regions in the west, and as well as those rivers, Prussia also had a better artificial network. Modern canals had arrived with the Industrial Revolution, and together with the smaller states, Prussia had a national railway network.
Not only with the Industrial Revolution, the canal system in Germany is pretty old and dates back to the Hanseatic League, when, for example, the Elbe-Lübeck channel was built to have a sea route from Hamburg and Lüneburg to Lübeck, which were the three centers of the Hanseatic League, as well as other canal systems that were built. But of course, the modernized canals were a thing of the Industrial Revolution.
Arrived with the Industrial Revolution, and together with the smaller states, Prussia had a national railway network before its major neighbours had even connected two cities. Austria was excluded from all of this because of its geography. These networks initially implied Prussia as the leader of Germany and isolated Austria. Germany was integrated culturally, economically, militarily and bureaucratically around Berlin. And
which was always a problem. When the Holy Roman Empire still was a thing, then this wasn't only the part that today is Germany, and also not only what is today Germany and Austria, but also a huge part of northern Italy. But they felt disconnected from the rest of the Holy Roman Empire and more or less their own thing, because more or less they were their own thing. They were the Kingdom of Italy with the emperor as their king. But the emperor couldn't really enforce being king there, because to do that he would have to cross the Alps, which is a hard thing to do, as Napoleon or Hannibal might tell you.
Culturally, economically, militarily and bureaucratically around Berlin. And while Prussia was in the process of connecting, Austria was dividing.
Which is also a very important part, which has its peak in the First World War. Austria is not only the German-speaking part of what is today Austria, but it's at this time a huge empire with very different cultures within it, with different languages in it, stretching from Austria to Hungary and down to Serbia, I think, at this point already. Not Serbia, but all surround Serbia. I'm not sure about that part. Part of Italy, and all these different ethnic groups in one empire, whereas the German Empire, or what Prussia would make the German Empire, was mostly and almost exclusively German, and had a German language, German culture, different German cultures, but still German cultures. The odd ones out were some more or less French and Czech and Polish people, but they were a vast minority within the whole hegemony of the German Empire. Whereas in Austria, the Hungarians, for example, were almost the majority compared to the Austrians.
Austria was dividing. The Enlightenment was the culmination of a philosophical revolution that led in part to the idea of self-determination. With failures of political and economic systems across the continent, the traditional order had been collapsing piece by piece, and in its place, new schools of thought were to arise. Here's an example of how a pre-Enlightenment country worked.
Spain versus the Dutch.
I don't want to have to pay all these taxes. I want to rule myself.
While you're living in my house, Booster, you abide by my rules.
What gives you the authority to decide what I have to do?
God, you don't know what? It's written down in this book that you can read because it's in Latin. But, trust me, I know it's in there.
One socio-political philosophical revolution later, and people broke those rules, and the Bible was translated anyway. People could now directly read the Word of God and interpret it in their own way, which led to an explosion in different schools of thought and churches.
which is somewhere a good thing. When I think Martin Luther was one of the first if not the first, who translated the Bible. At least he was the first who translated it in German and had it mass produced, because also the printing press was just invented. When were the printing press? 1452, and Martin Luther was 1515 around. So so he could spread the word, and the majority in Germany, of course, spoke German. And then you had the King Charles, was it the King Charles? King George Bible? Which king was it? In Great Britain, the English translation of the Bible, and so on and so on. And the huge part is that they could interpret it themselves, which is something, for example, the Muslims are not allowed to do. So they have the Quran in a language they can understand. It's Arabic, and if you speak Arabic, you can read the Quran. But officially, you're not allowed to interpret it, because that is a right only given to the imams and the equivalent of priests. I'm not an expert on Islam, but they have the privilege to interpret, but you can still read it. But so the religion has still somewhat of power over you, whereas with the Lutheran Revolution and the Protestantism, the church lost a lot of its power, because people were not prohibited from interpreting the Bible the way they thought. And so the Bible had not that much power over them, because there was no priest who could tell you, you shall obey the law, for example. If you could read the same text and say, I could. And the main thing that kept people from being criminals, from having a revolution, was religion. As Napoleon later would state, religion keeps the people from rioting, or something like that.
Have got and interpret it in their own way, which led to an explosion in different schools of thought and churches. The Catholic Church was no longer all-powerful, and the Word of God was no longer simply what you were told. People could think for themselves, and now they could rule themselves. And then later the French and American revolutions were all about self-determination and religion in government. Now let's look back at these 37 smaller independent German nations. In all of this furore, wasn't it just time for the region to unify?
By the way,
German nations. In all of this,
the classic German flag with the black, white and red is an homage, or not an homage, it's a mix of the Prussian flag, which is white and black, and the flag of the Hanseatic League, which is red and white. We had already seen it before this flag popped up. Then you had at the background the flag of Hamburg.
Now let's look back.
Here now in on the top of the screen, the little castle, that's the flag of Hamburg, which is, as a Hanseatic city, red and white. Those combined were then the first German flag.
At these 37 smaller independent German nations. In all of this furore, wasn't it just time for the region to unify? But around which of the two strong German powers would it be? Prussia or Austria? Let's compare. Prussia had great water and rail connections with the region. With Prussia, they shared a single common language. They were majority ethnic German, and Prussia had one of the strongest armies on the continent. Austria, however, was on the other side of the mountains, had 100 billion different languages across its territory, was rebellious and
Let's take a look at that map again.
Of the mountains, had 100 billion different languages.
Yeah, you see the Adriatic coast, you see Austria, huge parts of Czechia, Hungary, Slovakia, Serbia, Slovenia. Yeah, all around Serbia, and I think parts of what is now Serbia as well, but I'm not sure about that. All the way to the Ukraine. So it was so many different cultures, languages. There was no way to keep that up, and there was also no way they could rule over a unified Germany with that chaos within their own ranks.
Continent. Austria, however, was on the other side of the mountains, had 100 billion different languages across its territory, was rebellious and fragile from top to bottom, and was a country out of time. In fact, Austria was lucky to still exist as a multinational country after the Congress of Vienna. Most other new and reformed countries had abandoned the because God says so form of government and graduated to the nation-state self-determinism model, but not Austria. She married her way to the top, merging royal families and lands to build this empire. And she wanted to keep it all after the Congress, and that she did. However, the Czechs, Slovaks, Polish, Hungarians, Slovenians, Italians, Serbians, Croatians, Bosnians, Ukrainians and Romanians in her empire had different ideas that came from the Reformation and the Enlightenment. Ironically, one of the last...
And at that point, they all together were the majority and even took apart, like I said earlier, the Hungarians would have to be around the same numbers as the Austrians. So they had some influence, they had some power, that Hungary became equal kingdom within the Austrian Empire was because they used their power and their influence they had, and they threatened Austria. And then the emperor's wife, known as Sissi, came in, mediated, and they found a compromise that saw them, the Hungarians, being equal to the Austrians, and therefore leading to somewhat stability. But if you now have the German states joining in that empire, then there is no way they would let it happen, because then they would become the minority. By far.
Had different ideas that came from the Reformation and the Enlightenment. Ironically, one of the last places to unify in this period under the idea of the self-determined nation state was perhaps the seat of philosophical thought in Europe, Italy. 1866. Those Austrian lands that I mentioned earlier were on the other side of the Alps. Yeah, some of those were filled with Italians. That's a group of people who are currently warring their way across southern Europe, unifying under their flag. And Austria was in the way. They fought 3 wars to unify their lands under the because we said so kind of government. The first war didn't change much. The second war was a mild victory for Italy. The third war, however, came with incredible timing and was incredibly devastating to the future of Austria. The sweet relationship between Austria and Hungary that had worked for so long was souring. A series of wars of independence had to be managed, and worst of all, Hungary itself was in revolt. Prussia, seeing a rising power in the south and the potential downfall of a rival for the German leadership, decided that they might as well consolidate their problems into one easily repayable continental war. Austria was in no shape to lead anything by the end of the war. Not the German Confederation, not Germany, and by this point not even Austria. Hungarians made themselves equal in the empire, which now went by a different name. The kingdom and lands represented in the Imperial Council and the lands of the Holy Hungarian Crown of St. Stephen, or as we know it today, Austria-Hungary. Prussia easily scooped the remains of German Europe, and with a victory...
Also abbreviated as in Austria as KUK, which means kaiserlich und königlich. Because the Emperor of Austria and the King of Hungary were equal.
Or as we know it today, Austria-Hungary. Prussia easily scooped the remains of German Europe, and with a victory over France in yet another war, they declared the...
Not only over France, the so-called Einigungskriege or Unification Wars of Germany were a set of 3 different wars. We will explore them when I do the series on Otto von Bismarck of Extra History. But the short story is that Otto von Bismarck had his vision, and he played his cards almost perfectly. First, allying with Austria and going to war with Denmark to conquer the territories of Schleswig and Holstein, which today are one state named Schleswig-Holstein. He himself got Schleswig and Austria got Holstein out of it. Then he turned on the Austrians and fought the Second War of Unification with the Austrians over Holstein and over the power of the unified Germany, because he wanted Prussia to be the leading factor, and after that war it was clear that Prussia would be. And then we had the Norddeutsche Bund, the North German, however you call it in English. So there were still some parts of now Germany missing, which namely were Bavaria and what is now Baden and Württemberg. So they had to make them join, and he forged more or less a war reason with France, who by some diplomatic genius, he convinced the French that they were insulted by the Germans, whereas he convinced the Germans that they were insulted by the French, and make the French look as the aggressor in the war, so that Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg would join his war efforts against France. And then he defeated France so badly that his whole plan was on the brink of failing, because he captured Napoleon III, the then king of France, and by capturing him, he had no one to negotiate the terms and conditions of surrender with, because the then set up government in Paris was it was a whole difficult situation. He was winning too much. But after that, Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg joined, and we got the German Empire as we knew it then. I mean, not as we knew it today.
Birth of the German Empire in the Palace of Versailles, the French seat of power. At this point, what couldn't Prussia do? Austria-Hungary was a shambles on a rapid descent in power and wealth. It was an absolute tinderbox ready to ignite.
And then because Prussia already had these railways with all the German states, and because all those German states, those 32 states, had their own centers of power and money and industry, that's one huge factor why Germany was able to then, under a centralized government, were able to industrialize so fast, because they already had many partly highly industrialized areas all around the country, which is also one of the reasons why Germany has so many cities compared to other countries, and only 4 cities with over 1 million population, with the highest one being Berlin with just barely, I think, over 3 million, and the next one being Hamburg with 1.8 million, because the whole population was so spread out over the empire, because there already were those centers, which in England, for example, or in Great Britain, you had London and maybe Southampton and not Lisbon, Liverpool, and maybe Newcastle. You had some industrial centers where everyone drove to, but in those German city-states, every state had 1, 2, 3 of those centers where everyone was driven to, and they could grow rapidly, and they could then industrialize rapidly, because the infrastructure was then connected. There was a centralized government, and boom, success.
Hungary was a shambles on a rapid descent in power and wealth. It was an absolute tinderbox ready to ignite at the flick of a trigger. World War I, and despite for some reason allying with Austria-Hungary, the pair nearly steamrolled all of Europe, fueled by Germany.
Not for some reason. Austria was for over 1,000 years part of the Holy Roman Empire and leading the Holy Roman Empire for 350 years or so. And they're, at least Austria themselves, were of the of culture, of ethnics. They were Germans, so it's only natural to ally with them. They share a culture, they share a language, which is most important. Prussia has no reason to not ally with Austria, because they already made their point. They have proven to be the bigger might, and Austria needs a friend. And Austria was still useful in the eyes of Germany, even though they would prove to be not useful at all in the First World War.
German industry. For the second time in half a century, Germany capitalised over the internal volatility of a neighbouring country to make significant territorial gains, making it as far as 1,500 kilometres from Berlin, and essentially winning in the east, making all of these gains real and official, at least for a few months. One Treaty of Versailles, one demilitarisation, one hyperinflation, billions in reparations, one Great Depression, 2 decades of economic and social turmoil, and still, again, the country was nearly able to steamroll Europe a second time in the 20th century. And then...
Yeah, Germany is torn over centuries because each and every major war that took place in Europe took place in Germany, more or less, most of the wars. The coalition wars, many battles on German territory, and in Austrian territory, of course. Then you have medieval wars, the 30-year war, which saw, for example, cities like Magdeburg burned to the ground, and so on and so on. Of course, wars that did not involve Germany or countries near Germany, east of Germany, for example, were not taken. They did not happen on German soil mostly. For example, the 100 Years' War was mostly on French soil. But especially in those later years when there were global conflicts, when there were Europe-wide conflicts like the 7-Year War, also many battles on German soil. And of course, the First World War, which did not happen on German soil, but did devastate the Germans by a lot. I mean, they lost a lot of territory. They lost a lot of people in the war itself. They lost a lot of income, a lot of assets. They had to give away ships and engines and so much more on top of the money they had to pay. And they were not allowed to have an army, so they were more or less defenseless. And yet, within 20 years, they recovered, and not only recovered, but came out on top of the rest of Europe. And this within a matter of only around the first years of the reign of Hitler, because at that point Hitler became the dictator. Germany was still in shambles. There was still financial crisis. There was still high unemployment, still reparations to pay, still no armies, still vulnerable. And then Hitler came and steamrolled the German industry and skyrocketed everything and built an army. Within 6 years, they were so powerful they could take on the whole of Europe again. Of course, they had not enough oil to win the war, and it is a very good thing that they didn't. But if not for the US and if not for Russia being reckless with its own people, Germany would have won, even though they just lost a major war only 20 years before.
Again, the country was nearly able to steamroll Europe a second time in the 20th century. And then, one demilitarisation, one partial deindustrialisation, several occupations, one Cold War partition, half a century of separation, and then finally, unification. And today, this country is stunningly, once again, the economic and industrial centre of Europe.
And even was during the two Germanys, because West Germany had the economic miracle, as we all know. If you ever read Made in Germany, that was originally made as an insult, because British people should know if this is from Germany, it has not high quality. Today, Made in Germany means it has high quality, and maybe even one of the highest qualities you can get on this planet. And the Germans used that, and the Germans used so much more and still got out on top even before the reunification. In fact, the reunification saw them drop again a little bit, because then the whole GDP of the country dropped because of the GDR's GDP basically being non-existent. And even though you have to see that even today, most of this success, most of this prosperity is only for West Germany and very, very, very small selective parts of East Germany. Because even though every German is obliged to pay a so-called solidarity fee every month to rebuild East Germany, it is not really rebuilt. They had a massive loss of people, which then went to the west after the Unification. It is such a wasteland there, you can say. And I can say that because I am from East Germany, and I am from one of the worst parts of East Germany, which is the Ore Mountains, which is a former uranium. There was uranium, and the Soviets did put it out of the ground, and the whole area is radioactive slightly. There is not much else that the people could do. The whole region was built on mining, and there is nothing to mine of value today. The second most important thing out of the Ore Mountains is wooden thingies for Christmas. I don't know how you say it in English. I will put it in the info text box what I mean. Apart from that, there is not really much tourism, maybe a little bit of winter sport tourism, because it's a famous winter sport area. But apart from that, there is not much to do there. There's not much to see there except from ruins and some beautiful landscapes. But it is very, very underdeveloped, and this is true for many parts of former East Germany, or still East Germany technically. So even 30 years after the Unification, there are still lots of work to do, but still Germany is the fourth highest grossing country in the world after the US, China, and Japan. And Japan having a similar story.
This country is stunningly, once again, the economic and industrial centre of Europe, and practically its leader. But not in war this time, that's bad apparently. It's in the boardroom, on the leaderboard, the GDP rankings, the quality of life, and the football. France kept a permanent seat on the UN Security Council because a unified Germany was an incredible threat to them for a century, constantly upsetting Europe, dragging France again and again into catastrophic bloodshed. Until today, France still maintained one of the most expensive militaries in the world. They built the iron and coal community to make war unthinkable by tying their economies together,
which was
and
smart.
Take access to Germany's vast mineral and geographic wealth. In a Europe without borders, that's the great equalizer, no? It turns out the Germans turned even that to their advantage. The EU is a free and ready-made market. Germany is, as of 2016, by some measures the #1 exporting country in the world, competing with China, a country 20 times the size. And there are things that Germany has coped with better than any other Western country. After World War II, there was somewhat of a labour shortage, which was apparently something to do with all the working age men dying in catastrophic bloodshed or something, and they plugged the labour shortage with Mediterranean guest workers.
Not only West Germany did that. You had West Germany pulling many guest workers, especially from Turkey and Italy. And East Germany did the same, with most of their guest workers being from other communistic states, most notably Vietnam. So both parts of Germany did more or less the same and hired experienced workers from abroad to help rebuild the country, and having not to pay much.
Men dying in catastrophic bloodshed or something, and they plugged the labour shortage with Mediterranean guest workers. The potential collapse of the economy due to the structure of the welfare state and the ageing of the population that as of 2016 is taking its toll on Japan, Russia and Eastern Europe, soon to hit China and the West, and is being plugged in the Germany of the 2000s by citizens of the expanding EU, the best and the brightest of working age across the continent coming to Germany to work. That's a steady stream of potential tax-paying skilled workers and
But it is also seen as, by some, as a huge problem, because, of course, in many European states, there is a movement to the right in the last years. most notably in Great Britain with the Brexit and the Labour Party and so on, and of course in France with Marie Pen and how they were called, but to luckily a lesser degree also in Germany with parties like the AfD, which already have seats in the Bundestag, which are right populist parties seeking to not only leave the EU, but also getting rid of guest workers, getting rid of people from foreign countries, especially those who are from Muslimic countries. And this is a serious development that we have to keep an eye on if we want Germany to keep prosperous. It has to keep letting people in, and it has to remain in the European Union because that's more or less the center of what Germany has become, which is a good thing, as they tell here.
To Germany to work. That's a steady stream of potential tax-paying skilled workers and, crucially, their consumers, paying for the pensions of the aging and retired Germans, spending their twilight years finding Lebensraum, this time on the sunbeds of the Mediterranean.
Especially Mallorca. Mallorca is the number one traveling destination for Germans, where as far as I know, Ibiza is the number one for Great Britain. So yeah, the rise and fall of Germany. It's always interesting to see that despite all the things that happened here, despite all the bad things that happened here, not only the wars, but also the dictatorship, also the fact that until 150 years ago, Germany wasn't even a thing, and pretty much exactly 150 years ago. This year is the 150th anniversary of the foundation of Germany, or was already. So it is very interesting, and I hope that it can stay that way, and then not another dictator comes around and undoes all that. But I think Germany will come out living from that as well. So yeah, tell me what you think about the video. Tell me if you are not from Germany. Tell me what is your experience with Germany. What do you think when you think of Germany and the development that the country has made? Most importantly, if you like the video, leave a like and maybe subscribe. And if you don't like, then leave a dislike. Tell me why. Tell me what can I do better. And if you have an idea to what I can comment on, what you want to hear me comment on, then go ahead, tell me. And don't forget to also check out my gaming channel, which is Ready Play Gaming. And if you speak German, also my game show channel with game shows where you can win real money. Or just go to readyplay.de or readyplay.de, where all channels are combined. And you can see where new videos are and what kind of videos. But yeah, do that, and until next time, I have been Ossi Introduction. Thank you and good night.